Hello, this video is for Amy Ladbrook, Miss Ladbrook, who teaches LX1 and LY2. She wants a video on an inspector calls on the theme of social responsibility. That's a really well chosen topic. I'm delighted to make this video. I'm going to try and make it with as few quotations as possible. So the most important section when you're answering this is the arrival of the inspector. And the inspector arrives because BIRLING denies social responsibility. In other words, it's to correct that denial that the inspector is summoned. And we'll talk a little bit later about whether this is a supernatural occurrence or not. So BIRLING, but this is the point. I don't want to lecture you two young fellows again, but what so many of you don't seem to understand now when things are so much easier is that a man has to make his own way. And it's this bit, once he starts talking about each man looking after himself, that denies social responsibility. That's the antithesis of it. It's the opposite of social responsibility. And he repeats it. This acts almost like a spell, an incantation to summon the inspector. Has to look after himself and his family too, of course. Now, the use of course here shows that this is actually an afterthought. BIRLING isn't that interested in his family, except insofar they are a reflection on himself. So even his own family suffers. If you think of your own family as your social network, he's not really willing to network with his own family. Because Priestley is pointing out here that if we neglect everybody else except ourselves, it's very easy to then neglect the other people who make up ourselves, our families, and just concentrate on ourself, just that single self. And so long as he does that, he won't come to much harm. And this is the other theme of the play. You yourself might not come to much harm if you look after yourself, but the rest of society will. And that's why the inspector arrives, to show the literal harm that they have caused to other human beings. If you take Gerald's view that they could have been different girls, or human being if you take the view that it's the same girl. But the way some of these cranks talk and write now, you'd think everybody has to look after everybody else, as if we were all mixed up together like bees in a hive. So this, of course, is precisely Priestley's message. We are all linked together. This is interesting, this idea of social responsibility being like bees in a hive. But actually, if you see a hive as a construction that benefits all the inhabitants, it's a very good metaphor for how a society should work. And obviously, bees produce honey, sweetness, the very opposite of the bitterness, if you like, of what happens to Eva. Community and all that nonsense. But take my word for it, you youngsters, and I've learned in the good hard school of experience that a man has to mind his own business and look after himself. So this idea of the man looking after himself is repeated 3 times. And I think that's significant. It's like an incantation. If you think of the witches in Macbeth always talking in patterns of 3s, it's adding to this idea that the inspector may be supernatural and unwittingly summoned by BIRLING's own words. We hear the sharp ring of a doorbell. The key is sharp here, and Priestley wants to point out that this is a defining, changing moment in the play, because this is when social responsibility, in the form of the inspector, arrives to inspect them. So tactically speaking, in the exam, you've probably made about 5 points from this little section here. And now would be an opportunity just to go to the end of the play and look at the final reference to social responsibility. I won't do that for you here. I'll give you a bit more, just to make a more complete video, but don't think you have to reproduce everything that's in it. The next time that Priestley explores social responsibility is also through BIRLING, So he's making a direct link now between not just the selfishness of the upper class, but the way they express that selfishness through the capitalist system. And the point about the capitalist system is that it only exists to create profit for the owners of business. And so again, the capitalist system is the antithesis of social responsibility. It doesn't see society as something that needs to be helped, or at least if it is, it's only as an afterthought. And we'll return to that idea of the afterthought again, because Berling's going to end with those familiar words, of course. So, just before you came, I'd been giving these young men a little good advice. Now, about this girl, Eva Smith. So, this is quite interesting. I like to think of the play here as an early feminist text. So, all the sexism in the play starts with Birling, and because Priestley has created a character who we know is wrong through his references to the Titanic, we are therefore predisposed to dismiss everything he says. And there's this belittlement of Eva Smith, who's no doubt in her 20s, much the same age as Sheila, but dismisses her as a girl as of no consequence. I remember her quite well now. She was a lively, good-looking girl, and of course that's his most important characteristic about her. What he remembers are her looks. And this is profoundly important because in a society in which we all looked out for each other, women would not be judged first on their looks. I'm not going to pretend that we're not all judged on our looks, we are. But in a fair society, that certainly wouldn't be the first thing that's noticed. And what's even more important is that's noticed before her quality as a worker. And look at this. She is a good worker too. In other words, she is responsible for his profits. But even that is less important to him than how she looks. And this is a really dangerous feature of the society that the Birlings live in. Women are defined first by their sexuality. And then if we come up here, country bred, this is a loaded term, so she's from the country, but the idea that she's been bred almost puts her on the same par as livestock. In other words, she's not quite fully human. She's a girl for starters, and she's been bred. At the back of Birling's mind, there's a sexual reference here. You know, that is her purpose, as it is all women's purpose. So, a good worker too. In fact, the foreman there told me he was ready to promote her into what he called a leading operator, head of a small group of girls. But after they came back from their holidays that August, they were all rather restless, and they suddenly decided to ask for more money. They were averaging about 22 and 6, which was neither more nor less than is paid generally in our industry. And so here again is the fault of the capitalist system. Women can be paid a low wage, but they can't leave for better employment because the other businesses are paying an equally low wage. This is a monopoly or a cartel. So the main consequence of seeking profit is that it destroys society because it creates poverty. It has thousands or indeed millions of workers who can't seek better employment elsewhere because other employers are offering the same low wage. Then we've got this throwaway line, "I refused, of course," which also shows how little he values social responsibility. The inspector here acts as Priestley's mouthpiece, and in this exchange he's going to show exactly how Eva links to his main theme of social responsibility. So the inspector tells us what happened to Eva after she was sacked. She was out of work for the next 2 months. Both her parents were dead. So this detail is to show us the conditions of women who have had to leave the country and travel to the city for work. Often they won't choose to unless they're forced to by dire circumstances. And that gives us a different perspective on the workers. They're not there just seeking money. They're there because their circumstances at home have been so poor that they've had to take even poorly paid jobs in the city, so that she'd no home to go back to, and she hadn't been able to save much out of what Birling and Company had paid her. And that's a clear reference to the consequences of paying low wages and not thinking about the society or the well-being of the workers that you employ. So that after 2 months with no work, no money coming in, and living in lodgings with no relatives to help her, few friends, you can see the power of the list here as it builds up, how it accuses Birling of ignoring this amazing array of factors that has made her life miserable. Lonely, half-starved, she was feeling desperate. I should think so, it's a rotten shame. There are lots of young women living that sort of existence. So many readers of this play get quite annoyed that the inspector spells out quite so much what the moral lesson of the play is. Some people think it detracts from the drama. It just becomes a political message all the way through. And if you want an A star, that's one of the things you can explore. Does the inspector's political stance, spelling out his message at many opportunities, detract from the enjoyment of the performance, or do you think it adds to it? It's up to you. In every city and big town in this country, Miss Birling, if there weren't the factories and warehouses, wouldn't know where to look for cheap labour, ask your father. And this is a clear signal that the reason he's come to teach the moral lesson begins with Birling. So even though everyone in the family has committed some sort of crime towards Eva, a moral crime that is, it's that failure of social responsibility that starts it all off. Birling is the father of her misery and of her suicide, because if he and the other factory owners had a sense of social responsibility, tragedies like Eva's would not have developed. But these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. That again, of course, is Priestley's political message. I've had that notion myself from time to time. In fact, I've thought that it would do us all a bit of good if sometimes we tried to put ourselves in the place of these young women counting their pennies in their dingy little back bedrooms. So he's spelling out once again how Eva's fate is going to be to represent all these young women. Notice he does not call them girls, because he's trying to change the perception of women as purely sex objects or playthings of rich men. So in your A-star response, you could probably have skipped the previous section, but I'd advise you strongly to deal with this one. And in fact, you would deal with this speech here, I think, in almost any essay that could possibly come up, because it's relevant to every single character and every single theme in the play. So these are the inspector's final words. But just remember this: one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. So once again, that clear political message that we are sociably responsible to absolutely millions of people. This, of course, is a great contrast to the perhaps 100,000 people in the ruling classes, people who own the factories, own the land. It'll be a much smaller number than this. And the inspector is pointing out what a massive effect people like the Birlings have on a huge number of people. With their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness all intertwined with our lives. So another moral message here is not just that we have to see how we're connected with everyone else, but that the social purpose, or the purpose of society, is to increase everyone else's chance of happiness. And that's a completely different view to the capitalist view, which is that we increase our own chance of happiness in one particular way by increasing profit. And the inspector has a completely different view of what happiness is. It's not just about having enough money, it's also about love. That's another theme of the play here. Gerald and Eric both had opportunities to love Eva, but they chose not to. And one of the tragedies, of course, is that Eva did love Gerald, by his own admission. So, and what we think and say and do. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. So you should have seen elsewhere in my videos that this is the language spoken in church as part of the communion, and Priestley deliberately slips out of his political tone here and into a Christian one. And that's important because Jesus, of course, preached social responsibility. If you like, that's a good summary of his teachings. And this allows Priestley to draw on the religious beliefs, the Christian beliefs that his audience already have. And he says, look, my political views as a socialist are actually no different from your moral views as a Christian. They're one and the same. And therefore, if you are a true Christian, is what he's arguing, if you are a true Christian, you cannot help but be a socialist. We are responsible for each other. And I tell you that the time will soon come when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night. So this is a clear reference to the First World War and to the Second World War. And Priestley here is defining his interpretation of history. And that interpretation is, because we neglected social justice, we neglected justice in all its forms. And therefore, we marched ourselves to war. He also sees the lack of social justice as akin to being deluded. So BIRLING doesn't understand history because he's deluded. And that, if you like, that delusion is the same thing that stops him caring about other people. So a more profound point here is that Priestley is arguing, if you don't think we are all responsible for each other, you are actually a deluded human being. You're not seeing the world as it truly is. If you have time, you might also use this final bit here, where Eric and Sheila remember those words from the inspector, but Eric in particular points to the idea that the arrival of the inspector is not normal. Sorry, that's the wrong bit here. Where is it? Ah, there we go, it's Sheila. Is that when the inspector came in, just after father had said that? So Eric connects his father's words to the appearance of the inspector, and Sheila realizes how important that is. And this, of course, is before that they find out that he has any supernatural insight. That insight only happens with the final phone call, if you like. And of course, you don't have to see it as a supernatural occurrence. But Sheila realizes how important this moment is. For her, she realizes that the whole moral of his visit, the purpose of his teaching, is to show us that social responsibility is the only solution to the tragedy they find themselves in. So I hope you found that useful. Good luck in your exam tomorrow. If you want more videos, because there's another exam on Friday, don't forget to subscribe. And good luck to both classes. I hope you do really well.